Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, heading out to the Pac-12 for a key North Division matchup as Cal hosts the Washington Huskies. We're joined by Chris Fetters of Dogman, the 247 platform for Washington sports and Washington football in particular. Chris, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So my first question has to do with the mindset of and they could be completely different, but the fan base and also the players on this team that were thinking Pac-12 championship, certainly decidedly considered the best coming into the season, the best team, and dropping the early game. Okay, then you need to right the ship from there, and there was the narrow margin once you got into conference play because of the Auburn loss, and basically out of the college football playoff for all intents and purposes right now. So is there disappointment both from the fan base and the players?
Well, I think that, there's still everything to play for in terms of winning the Pac-12 North, getting to the Pac-12 title game, winning that, and then, getting to the Rose Bowl as the Pac-12 representative. Or, at some point there is going to be a two-loss team that makes the college football playoff. Do I think it's Washington this year? No, I don't think it's Washington this year. I think there's probably some other ones. But at the same time, if you look at the polls, if you look at the way Washington was treated as a one-loss team early in the season, they got a lot of credit for that loss at Auburn. I think it's looking less and less like a good loss, like maybe people thought it would. So in that sense, it's a little tough. And then you lose, a game in overtime that they should have won at Oregon. They had a last-second kick to win it, and it just sailed wide right, and then they lose in overtime. I think they'll get credit for that loss. It's a very, very tough loss too. But then Oregon goes on the road and they suffered the same thing at the hands of Washington State this last Saturday. So right now it feels like the Pac-12 is kind of a circular firing squad. They're kind of killing each other. And then now Washington State's got to go on the road. They got to go to Stanford on Saturday. And if Stanford beats Washington State, we literally see the same cycle repeating itself week after week after week. And the conference out here on the West Coast, they're kind of cannibalizing themselves and taking them right out of the playoff discussion for sure. But while I don't think Washington will make the playoff, I don't think any two-loss Pac-12 team will make the playoff. I still think there's so much to play for, and there's so many Washington fans that have such good memories from going to the Rose Bowl as far back as the 60s. The 60s. The 78 Rose Bowl was a huge turning point for Don James and turning the early part of his program around at Washington. And then you have the Rose Bowls in the early 90s when they won the national championship, the 91 team. And then you go to 2000 when Rick Neuheisel won a Rose Bowl where they beat Drew Brees and Purdue. That was the last time Washington's ever been to a Rose Bowl. So there's literally a whole generation of Washington fans that have never even seen the Rose Bowl postseason. They've seen them when they play at UCLA, but they've never seen a Rose Bowl where Washington is playing a Michigan or a Ohio State or a Penn State or an Iowa or like it was in the past. And so it's just one of those things where they still have a lot to play for. I think the fans are still very, very excited about this season, especially if it comes down to the point where the Apple Cup means the winner gets to play in the Pac-12 title game. I think there would be nothing sweeter for a Washington fan than to go to Pullman, beat Washington State, get to that Pac-12 title game, and then figure out, are you playing Utah? Are you playing USC? Are you playing, they could maybe even play UCLA again. I mean, you just never know because the Pac-12 South is such a cluster. You just don't know what's going to happen in that part of the conference.
So for those of you who don't realize, Chris is referring to a Warren Moon-led team that beat Michigan in 1978. There were a couple efforts against Iowa. 1981 season, and then moving to the end of the decade in 1990, I believe, if I've got my years straight, against Iowa. And then, the back-to-back years against Michigan, winning the one, losing the next one, but the 91 season culminating with a tie for the national championship. And then the Marcus Tuiasosopo team that beat Drew Brees in the Rose Bowl in January of 2001. And then, the abyss, the desert for Washington football, and brought back in recent years.
Hey, Mark, I would also be remiss to say that 2000 team with Marcus Tuiasosopo, Marcus was just inducted today. The final ceremony will happen in mid-January, but he was just inducted with three other Polynesian players into the 2019 class for the Polynesian Hall of Fame. So that's a huge honor for him. I think he goes in with Lofa Tutupu, who played at USC and with the Seahawks. And then Joe Salavea, the current Oregon defensive line coach, is also part of that group. So a huge honor for Marcus, and just wanted to give him a shout out. He is actually the current quarterback coach at Cal. So that'll be interesting that Washington goes to play Cal this weekend on the week that he was inducted to the Polynesian Hall of Fame.
Absolutely. So Washington may have to go to battle with Cal with either Miles Gaskin on the sideline or a compromised Gaskin, who's, of course, as we run down memory lane in all-time greats, is the all-time leader in rushing.
Yep.
Here at Washington, 623 yards, 4.5 per carry, 5 touchdowns. Not exactly his best season, but still a solid season out of Miles Gaskin, averaging close to 100 yards per game. Where is his status right now based on what we know?
Well, it's tough, Mark, because he has been so durable and so consistent throughout his 4 years at Washington. The Colorado game, this last game that Washington played, they won 27-13, but it was without Miles Gaskin. It's the first time he's ever missed a game in his career at Washington. So he went, upwards of 40-some games without missing a start. And so that was impressive, that run. We don't know what his status is going to be like at Cal this weekend. But the 3 running backs in his replacements, in terms of Savon Ahmed, Sean McGrew, Kamari Pleasant, they all did a really, really nice job against Colorado. They ran for a combined total, I think, of 201 yards against the Buffaloes, giving Jake Browning more than enough time to do his play action, his other things, and be able to drive the team down and get a couple touchdowns and be able to eventually pull away at the end. So I would think it's 50-50 for Miles right now. The way the schedule lines up, they play at Cal, and then they have to go and they come back to Seattle and they host Stanford this following weekend, and then they get their bye week. So they will literally have played 10 games before they get their bye. So right now is conventional wisdom knows that if they go ahead and beat Cal, there's a lot riding on that Stanford game. Do you wait another week and then bring Miles back before giving him a couple more weeks off with the bye week? Or do you give him all of that time off, including the bye week, and then allow him to come back as fresh as maybe he could possibly be for the final 2 games, which is they host Oregon State and then they play Washington State on the road the day after Thanksgiving. So there's kind of the 2 scenarios. I'm of the belief personally that I think the way the injury has gone for him, I'm not 100% sure that he will even play against Stanford. I don't think he'll play this weekend. That's my opinion, based on just what I've seen and how he reacted when he got kind of re-injured at Oregon. It was, he tried to tape it up. He tried to give it a go, but in the second half, it just was it was a non-starter for him. He wasn't able to really come back at 100%. And really at this point, trying to get to that 1,000-yard mark is so huge for him personally, because he would become the first guy in Pac-12 history with 4 straight 1,000-plus rushing years. No one else in the conference has ever done it before, even when it was the Pac-10, Pac-8, what have you. And you've got so many amazing running backs, USC, Oregon, UCLA, all of them. Stanford's had a bunch. So, there's a lot riding on it for him. So I really think they're going to try to treat him with as much caution as they can possibly give him, but at the same time, knowing how important he would be to, their overall cause in terms of trying to beat a team like Stanford, for instance, which that game right now looks like it could be a really, really important game in the Pac-12 North.
So, Chris, this comes from a guy that watches Washington play 4 or 5 times a year, and you could guess what games those are. So, with all due respect to Miles Gaskin, he obviously has a certain status because of his profile, because of what he has accomplished there with the school and so forth. But we've seen, I'm not as familiar with McGrew and Pleasant. I've obviously seen him on the field run the ball, but nothing really stood out to me. But Salvon Ahmed is obviously, as soon as I saw him play at the end of last year, he seems to be the home run guy, the guy that can take it to the house. So how much do they really miss with Gaskin, considering they've got 3 capable running backs and Ahmed's such a home run hitter?
Well, it's true. There's no doubt. I mean, we just got done with our radio show up here, and our host Kim, he was talking about how a lot of people think of Savon as kind of the Ferrari or the Lamborghini of that running back core, because if he gets in the open field, he's gone. And he ran a 4.33 at the opening a few years back. Was considered one of the fastest guys there. So we know he's got the speed to when he gets into the open field, he's gone. But Sean McGrew ran a 10.56 when he was at St. John Bosco in California, when he was the Gatorade State Player of the Year. So even though he's 5'7", he's no slouch, and he does use kind of that lack of size to his as a positive. I mean, he really can kind of wiggle through the tackles and make some people miss. And then when he tries to get outside, he can really start to create some things, and he's got nice moves. Kamari Pleasant is definitely one of those more kind of one cut and slash type guys, and he's kind of considered the big back. But he's only 205. So yeah, are they going to miss a ton with Myles Gaskin not being out there? Not if they can use him on the sideline with his experience and his know-how and his eyes on the, that he can see the game. And when he's watching the game and he can see what happened, he can give little tidbits. He can kind of give them a perspective of what he's seeing. So there's a lot of value to that. But if he's not 100%, those other three guys right now are Washington's best bet to create a running game to help Jake Browning. So there's no doubt that unless he gets cleared and he's got a real chip on his shoulder, so to speak, and he can really get it done and just power through this thing, then I think they should rest him. But the thing about Myles Gaskin, Mark, when you get to know him, this kid's a warrior. And if you saw him at the end of the UCLA game, for instance, when they really needed a touchdown in clutch time, his shoulder was hurting him, and they just kept going to him. They just kept feeding him. And he almost literally single-handedly ran that ball right into the end zone. And you could tell he was hurting. He was banged up. So my feeling on the whole thing was I thought it was just going to be a matter of pain threshold and tolerance. So basically you couldn't screw it up any more than it was, maybe medically. So it was just a matter of, okay, how much punishment can you take on it? How many hits can you take on it from just a pure pain standpoint? That's what I kind of thought was happening. But clearly at the Oregon game, I think something a little different happened. And now that's part of the equation, I don't know. I mean, we'll really see. But you're right. I mean, when it comes down to it, a guy like Savon, he can take over a game if he needs to. And I think guys like McGrew and Pleasant, even though maybe you didn't see a ton coming out of them, I think they have a chance to continue to affect games in a positive way and gain even more experience and just kind of get better and better and better as the weeks go on.
We're joined by Chris Fetters. You can join him on dogman.com and the 247 platform for Washington football. Chris mentioned to me before we started to record that Jake Browning will either tie or eclipse Matt Leinert's Pac-12 wins record for a quarterback, which is quite. When you talk about quarterback play down through modern college football history, I don't know that any conference supersedes the Pac-12. And to hold that record is rarefied air. I'm looking at Browning's statistics, and I think it's something that we discussed both with you and just in general during the offseason was in my analysis of the team and looking through and discussing with folks like you, Chris, is that this team missed explosive plays last year. And that's one of the missing elements after throwing 43 touchdowns the year before. And obviously John Ross being in the offense for the playoff team. And I see 11 touchdowns and 7 interceptions, and I see 65% completion percentage. Certainly nothing wrong with that. So did the concern come to fruition in regards to maybe not creating as many big plays in this offense thus far?
Yes. Short answer is yes. And it is interesting because you mentioned the 2016 season when he was the Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Year, had tied the mark with Jared Goff with the 43 touchdowns. He had John Ross, he had Dante Pettis, he had even last year he had the true freshman in Hunter Bryant and Dante Pettis were big parts of creating explosive plays. But so I went back and looked at the 2016, 17, and 18 season so far through like the first 7 FBS games, because each year they've played an FCS team. But if you look at all those other 7 games through the 2016, 17, and 18 years, 2017 or 16, they had almost 40 plays of 25 yards or more. and that was just through 7 FBS games. This year they have less than half of that. So it's not good. I mean, and part of it is clearly they don't have the playmakers. They don't have John Ross. They don't have Dante Pettis. They don't have Hunter Bryant because Hunter's hurt right now. And he might be coming back. And that's another thing we can talk about. He could be a factor. I don't know if it'll be this week. I don't think it will be. But he might be a factor, for instance, during Stanford. And that could be huge because Jake Browning needs more of those guys. He lost Quentin Pounds, one of their big play guys, for the season to another knee injury. It's the third year in a row he's had a knee injury that's kind of curtailed his season, which is really, really bad news, and it's unfortunate for sure. But yeah, you look at that, and he's done that, and they don't look downfield as much. And it almost feels like they've kind of hung their hat on this identity of grinding things out, using the run game to set up the pass, and just trying to, just kind of dink and dunk and, maybe finding some intermediate routes. But they very rarely have tried to take the top off of defense this year. The only time they really did it, ironically enough, was the first game of the year against Auburn, when they had Ty Jones down the field, they had Pounds down the field, they had Aaron Fuller down the field, and they were able to create, I think, about 4 or 5 plays of 25 yards or more. And outside of the game, I believe against, there was another game, maybe it was BYU or it was another game. I don't think they've created as many explosives as they did against Auburn. So in the first few games, they seem to do a decent job, and now they've kind of settled into this grind it out, eat up the clock, move the chains, just kind of eventually, because they feel so good about what they can do defensively. And the other thing too is, Mark, they haven't been able to create any sort of turnovers defensively. They have a negative turnover ratio right now, which I can't remember even saying that this late in the year for a Chris Peterson team at Washington. It just doesn't happen. I mean, usually they're really, really good about it. And then, as we know, a lot of times turnovers can come in bunches. There can be a situation where now all of a sudden, for some reason, they get 4 or 5 turnovers a game and everything's going, okay, well, why did that happen? It's not like they weren't not teaching it, all the going through the drills and everything else all year, but for some reason they all of a sudden came up and now they were getting picks and they were getting fumble recoveries and things like that. Because against Colorado, they had an early fumble where they could have pounced on it, maybe could have gotten a touchdown, and that could have turned the game really on its head early. But instead, Colorado gets the ball back and they score their only touchdown of the game on that same drive. So there are some things where Washington's kind of shooting themselves in the foot. I think not having the lack of explosives is just maybe a part and parcel of the whole thing, where Washington has just kind of not so much gotten in their own way a little bit, but there's been some things that have been working against them. That's one, not getting the turnovers. Red zone difficulties for sure have been huge. They have not been able to do. I think it was 51% I saw was the ratio of touchdown percentage of all the red zone opportunities. So of all the times they get in the red zone, they're only scoring touchdowns half the time. That's not going to get it done if you're a top 15 football team.
I got to tell you, Chris, my impression of this wide receiver core came in game 1 against Auburn. And I got familiar with some names that you just mentioned that I wasn't familiar with because of the turnover at the wide receiver position. And I thought, these guys weren't taking the top off the defense, but I thought they were making exceptional plays along the sidelines. I thought they were out fighting Auburn defensive backs for the football. They were showing great hands. And I'm looking these guys up and I'm thinking, oh, he only caught 7 passes last year. And now he's going up against Auburn, national TV, huge game, making exceptional plays. And this was happening play after play after play. They had, a handful, 4 to 6 receptions that I thought were exceptional out of the entire group in that game. And then you mentioned Hunter Bryant, just looked him up. So your own 247 Sports rated him a top 159 player coming out overall, regardless of position. And the 5th rated tight end coming out in 2017. So yeah, that would be a welcome addition.
Yeah, no, he was a freshman All-American last year, and that was even getting hurt because he got hurt in the UCLA game, if I remember. I don't remember which game that was in the year, but it was probably like this maybe 8th or 9th game of the year, 7th or 8th game of the year. And he just had a really phenomenal year leading up to that point and was a real difference maker and really caused a lot of problems because we're talking about a kid who's 6'2", 6'3", 240 pounds. He could get downfield. He could get up, like you said. He could make plays in traffic. He could get jump balls because he was going after. He was getting lined up with like nickels and linebackers and was creating. He was an instant problem for whoever he got lined up against. And so not having him has been a big negative for Washington in terms of trying to find more guys that can create explosives with them. Right now, they're pretty much just hanging their hat on Aaron Fuller, who's become really the go-to guy for Washington. I think Andre Bocelli is adding some things, but then Ty Jones, you mentioned Ty, Mark. Ty is really kind of their tall threat. Like if they want to throw a fade at the goal line, or if they want to throw a jump ball one-on-one situation along the sideline, he's the guy that they're going to ask to do that pretty much every time.
We got Chris Fetters on the line from Dogman. It's the 247 Sports platform for Washington football, with the Huskies taking on Cal coming up this week. And Chris, you outlined it for us off the top in regards to the round robin of sorts in the Pac-12 North Division. So most of us put Oregon at the top, Oregon and Stanford in the mix. Originally, Washington State's played their way into it, and certainly with a huge, enormous win at home last week in holding off Oregon. So I think it's probably a bit too early to play out scenarios because you got 4 teams involved and a number of games yet to be played. But Washington obviously losing the head-to-head against Oregon, but at the same time, they have the opportunity to win the other games against Stanford. And then the Apple Cup, it's still pretty much within their grasp, I would think, with Oregon losing a second game now in the Pac-12. So,
yeah, Mark, seriously, all of the teams right now with 1 losses in the Pac-12 North have still yet to face each other. That's the craziness of this schedule right now. Stanford, Washington State have not played each other. They won't until starting this weekend when Stanford and Washington State play. And then it's all going to start to fall apart or come together, or however you want to look at it. But yeah, that's the craziness of this thing, because we literally could see that circular firing squad where Stanford beats Washington State, Washington beats Stanford, Washington State beats Washington. It's like, okay, then they all have 2 losses. Then what? And if Oregon goes unbeaten, Oregon beat Washington, but they lost to Washington State, and they lost to Stanford. So now they're out of it again because two out of those 3 teams beat them. So you're starting to go into tiebreaker scenarios depending on how these things all come together. But again, that's the beauty of the North, and that's the beauty of the drama of how the schedule was put together, that all the 1-loss teams haven't even played each other yet. And so it could get really screwy by the end of this thing.
And that's why, without a dog in the race, I just love to see college football, and I love to see scenarios, whether it's the last day of baseball season in which you're looking at a playoff game, play-in game, or the NFL playoff scenarios on the final weekend, or in this situation, I don't want to see 2 7-2 teams in the conference where it's just, okay, who won the football game? I would love to see the 3-way scenario just to see the tiebreaker system fall into play. All right, Chris Fetters from Dogman 247 Sports. Please join him right there for the very best in Washington football coverage. The Cal Golden Bears are up next. Chris, we appreciate you jumping on board and helping us out.
Of course. Anytime, Mark.